For Module 7, we're going to be looking at lists. Now, if you're not brand new to computer programming, you might be used to the term arrays. And you can think of a list as almost the same as an array, except in Python, we're just going to be using lists. That's kind of all you need to know, really. Now, before we start with lists, I just want to review a few different data types that we've already looked at. And so I've got this little program here where A is 5, B is 3.14, C is true, and D is Josh is the best. And we're just going to print the value to the screen along with the type that value is. So when I run it, you can see that 5 is an integer, 3.14 is a float, true is a boolean or bool, and Josh is the best is a string. Now, just as a review, if I were to put this 5 into quotation marks, it's no longer actually an integer. So when I run it, you can see 5 is now a string because anything inside quotation marks is a string. And string is just short for string of characters. It really is actually a list of letters. The first letter is a J, and then an O, and an S, and an H, and so on. Yeah, but we can have a new kind of data type. So besides integers, put our integer back, besides integers, floating point numbers, booleans, and strings, we have a new kind. And I'll make that E. And the new kind is called a list, of course. And here is one very simple example of a list. We're going to use square brackets, and we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have a list of numbers. So now when we print E and then the type that E is, we can see it. So you can see that E is right here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the class, the type of variable that E is a list. Okay, so we have lists. Now, a list can really be anything. It doesn't have to be numbers. So for example, I can have a list of names, for example, Josh, and then my next thing can be Pollock. So there's a list, and the list has my first name and then my last name. So when I run that, you can see Josh Pollock is my list, and the class is still a list. Notice that each element in our list has to be separated by a comma. Now, it doesn't have to be all of the same thing either. So for example, I could have my first name and then some random number that I chose. So when I run it again, you can still see here's my list. It's still a list, except that now my list happens to have a string in it and an integer in it. And we can actually take this one step further. We can have a list of lists. So for example, 1, 2, that's a list, right? Well, that could be the first thing in my list. And then 3, 4, there's another item in my list. And then let's say 3, 4, 5. So here I've got a list, and inside my list I've got 3 lists. The first list in my list is only 2 elements long. The next one is 2 elements long, and the last one is 3 elements long. And notice where I've got to have my commas. I always have a comma separating my items in my list. So inside my first list, I have a 1 and a 2, and they're separated by a comma. This comma means here's the first thing in my E list, comma, here is the second thing in my E list, and here is the third thing in my E list. So when I run that, you can see it's got all of these things, and it's still just a list. It's actually a list of lists. So there is your first introduction to lists.